Okay.
All right, so it's a great pleasure to welcome Krista West from the Aluminium Stewardship Initiative. She's the Director of Standards at ASI. She has a distinguished background, having worked in standards and certification for much of her career. Her first degree was actually in forestry from University of British Columbia, and then she has graduate degrees as well in related topics around, I think, certification issues as well. And she was a lead auditor at the International Standards Organization, which I mentioned earlier to our group as well. And so she's really eminently qualified to give us both the big picture, but today she is going to be doing a deep dive on her current role with the Aluminium Stewardship Initiative, but I'm sure she would be willing to address questions also where appropriate more broadly, including her work with ISO. So thank you so much, Krista, for joining us.
My pleasure. It feels like only yesterday I was on the other end of this seat. So I was adding up numbers of years and things, and I was thinking, I probably shouldn't do that. So one thing, it actually wasn't ISO that I was an auditor for, it was FSC. So the Forest Stewardship Council. So just, so I actually know like only superficial information about ISO. So don't ask me any questions about that. Well, you can, but I might not be able to answer. So yeah, thank you for having me. It's actually a lot of fun getting ready for this and to think back. I did my master's and it was in public administration, and certification was just a really new thing back then. And I remember debating in one of my projects with one of my professors about whether it would ever get off the ground. And so it's funny that I've managed to make my whole career in this thing that was actually not that long ago, really just a theoretical idea. So as you said, I started in the Forest Stewardship Council system. I worked for the Rainforest Alliance, an organization out of New York. And I started as an auditor, so and clearly in forestry because that was my background. So I was a social auditor primarily. So I worked with Indigenous peoples, communities, and workers. So that ended up being my area of expertise in certification. I went on from working on the auditing side to working on the certification side in mining of sand, gravel, and rock and aggregates, and then onwards to aluminum. So I've worked, I think, almost everywhere in terms of certification a little bit. I've done dozens of audits. I managed the Canadian portfolio of 40 million hectares of forestry certifications at one point. So I used to bid on contracts with jobs. I used to hire contractors to do our audits. I've written now a couple of certification systems. I've dabbled a little bit in monitoring and evaluation, though that isn't my expertise. I play a little bit in governance, so kind of like a little bit in all of the bits of certification. So I'm happy to answer questions on any of them, but I say that by saying I've worked a little bit everywhere, but I'm not an expert in anything. So that's my disclaimer. So let's have a look through. Let's see how my screen is going to work with Zoom. There we go. Okay. I'm going to go back and forth a little bit because one of the things about certification is it's all interconnected. So, you know, there's really no piece of it that works all entirely on its own. But looking here at the ASI vision and mission, the goal was to maximize the contribution of, and we are an Australian European organization. So I had to relearn how to say aluminum into aluminium. So the contribution of aluminium to a sustainable society. And so it's really quite a holistic big picture. And then the mission was to recognize, or was and still is, to recognize and collaboratively foster responsible production, sourcing, and stewardship. So kind of right there off the bat, you'll see the groundwork for what I'll talk a fair bit about today, and that's that we're looking at the whole supply chain. So it's not just the production, but it's also the sourcing and stewardship of aluminium. And by the nature of, I think, metals in particular, but I think, you know, even if I think back to my forestry days, this kind of holistic approach really makes a lot of sense in certification. We're one of the few systems that do it this way. So it's interesting to kind of compare and contrast the different models, but having worked in a system that didn't look at the whole supply chain, I have to say I'm a believer now in this kind of holistic perspective that ASI has adopted. So in terms of a brief history of whence we came, we're a relatively new organization. Conversations started in 2009 with a multi-stakeholder group wanting to talk about responsible aluminium. You counter that with FSC that was in existence kind of 20 years before. And then, certification was a little bit late to the mining metals industry. So 2009, we and I wasn't there, but they started discussions. 2011, there was an agreement to develop the ASI work program. So that's when we decided that certification was going to be the answer to promoting, defining what responsible aluminium was. In the next couple of years, they drafted our performance standard. And in certification systems, everyone likes to talk about the standard and how we look at the work on the ground, which is an important part, but is actually such a small part of the whole certification system, but a big piece. So between 2011, 2014, they got that big piece in terms of what responsible aluminium looked like in a standard. So that was 2014. Up until that point, IUCN had hosted us and facilitated the discussions. It was decided in 2015 that ASI should become an organization of its own. So we did that in 2015. We incorporated, hired staff of our own, developed our own governance, all of that sort of thing, which is feels very, very boring, but it actually, the governance model sets up the success for, in my opinion, for the entire future of the certification system. So hugely important work that was done in 2015. 2016, we had our first annual general meeting. So if you think about it, really, really new organization, 5 years old from our first annual general meeting of our members. Where we adopted our constitution, our vision, and our mission. Between 2016, I joined ASI in 2017, and I have to say every year has been busy, but those years were kind of crazy. So in those years, we revised the performance standard that was written in 2014. We also developed our chain of custody standard, which I'll talk a little bit more about, our assurance manual, our claims guide, and kind of all of the structure of ASI was developed in those 2 years. We launched the full program in 2017 in December. We launched, I want to say, I should know this date off. We launched in December. I did the first training of auditors 2 weeks later in Montreal, Quebec, and we had our first certification out the door in January. So literally we had our documents finalized, and I ended up with not quite carpal tunnel, but wrist problems from the speed of having to develop the whole entire training program in a couple of weeks to deliver it. So in terms of like the speed at which this was launched and was taken up was really phenomenal. 2018, so as I said, within a month and a half, 5-6 weeks, we had our first certification. That was Rio Tinto out of Quebec here in Canada. We became an Icl Alliance member. We're now a full Icl Alliance member. And now fast forward to 2021, we're revising those standards again. That's what I do full time now. We have 160 ASI members, over 110 certifications. And we thought last year with the pandemic, we'd slow down. We didn't, we continued to grow. So I'd mentioned a little bit about how standard systems are complicated. Folks like to talk a lot about what we call the performance standards. So these are kind of on the ground practices, but I would say each one of these documents is equally critically important. I've already talked a little bit, and I could go on for hours about governance, but I won't go there today. We have a standard setting procedure. If you don't have a good standard setting procedure, I can tell you the collaborative discussions trying to get people to agree to things are a disaster. terms of references, chain of custody standard. You have to have some sort of document that outlines how you do your audits. So that's 100 pages of really, really interesting reading if you're looking for something before bed. How you manage, train, accredit your auditors all has to be decided. You have to have strong procedures there. What people are allowed to say about you and then about the claims they make, hugely important. And then all of that we monitor, and it feeds back into the cycle on an ongoing, never-ending, continuous basis that goes on kind of, year after year after year. So I'll focus on a couple of these things today. A little bit more context. I said at the beginning in terms of the model that we are whole value chain. So we look at everything from the mine through the refinery, the smelter, semi-fabrication and fabrication. So that could be a small facility in an industrial area in just about any small town across the world. The product use, we don't certify that phase. Anyone is allowed to use a beer can without us talking about it. But we do jump back in and looking at scrap collection and refining, remelting. One of the things about aluminum, highly recyclable, it never degrades in quality. I think about, I forget these numbers, 80% of all aluminum ever produced in the world is still in production. So how we do this is really, really important to the aluminum cycle. Also, the more we do it, so we're losing 20%, and we're losing most of that post-consumer. So a lot of those beer cans, building windows, car structures are ending up in the landfill back. So when I said we wanted to look at responsible sourcing and stewardship, it's really this piece here in terms of how we get that material back. Because the more material we get back, the less we have to mine. So for our industry, we couldn't just look at one of those things. We had to look at the whole cycle together. Another way of looking at this is that we have dozens of facilities in this chain where each one of them is implementing the practices that we say in the performance standard. They're sourcing the material and then they're passing it on to the next one. Till at some point we end up at the end of the supply chain and somebody is putting a claim on a product to say this is ASI certified. We had our first ASI certified products hit the market last year. We had aseptic water containers in the UK hit the market. So we now have ASI logos on product. And really what that means is that we can say that from these stories at the mining level through to through all of those facilities, we can now say that we have responsible sourced and produced aluminium, and we can put that claim, or our member companies can. We don't do it ourselves. They can put it on products. We're hoping very soon to have that logo, of course, on other things. But in terms of uptake for a certification system, 2 years from start to finish is really very quick. So in terms of impact, to actually be able to make that connection from the claims, from the practices, environmental and social practices, to a claim on a product is really huge. And of course, we wouldn't be a certification system without measuring all of that progress. So kind of, I'll talk about this more at the end. I'll show you our website where you can see all of this data. But since since inception, we've grown our membership. So as I said, year over year, we show membership growth. Even through the pandemic in 2020, we showed membership growth. And that's translated directly into certification growth. So from 2017 to date, we have 80 performance standard certifications in over 40 countries around the world. So, in terms of having an impact, you can't have any impact unless you have a certification. So to be able to show that growth kind of year after year is going to translate into impact on the ground. Another way we show this data is in terms of volumes. So we've partnered with the International Aluminium Association out of the UK, which is a member-based industry association. They've been tracking volume data for the industry for a long time. I don't know their stats, but over decades, and they make a lot of projections into the future. So I'll show you this diagram, but it's on our website and on theirs. But what we added last year to their diagram is this green line, which is now ASI Aluminium. So as you can see, we have a fair amount of production, well, not a fair amount from my perspective as having looked at all of those reports. But in terms of the whole scheme, it's still just a sliver of the production. But then as you go through, we're not carrying that from facility to facilities. So we lose that kind of volume in terms of the tracking through the entire system. But we are tracking that volume. Last year was our first year, or 2019 was our first year. We reported it in 2020. And we'll continue to show this over time. And you'll be able to actually go on this diagram and you can click through time. So you can see, hopefully in time, that little green sliver grow to a wider and wider belt over time. So just kind of background on us. I'll do questions at the end if that works for you, because I think it all interrelates. Okay. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the standards. We are a consensus-based decision organization. That means we talk a lot. This last year, I facilitated those meetings. We had 56 online meetings over a 52-week period. I did take a little bit of vacation. So we're doing meetings, global meetings, probably at the rate of 1 to 2 a week through our standards development. We have 150 different folks that participate in those discussions. And at the end of the day, we're aiming for a collaborative consensus decision, which we talk about human rights, we talk about environment, we talk about really difficult topics. So to be able to bring that variety of people from the entire globe and reach a consensus decision making is a huge amount of effort in terms of hearing people, but also having people express their views and bringing that all to kind of one set of words on the screen. Our approach to that is that ASI looks at really kind of everything that's relevant to the aluminium industry. Carbon intensity is important. People like to talk a lot about carbon when that relates to aluminium, because it's a huge producer of carbon. So massive issue. We talk about it a lot, but it's not the only thing we talk about. And one of the things we recognize is that all of the sustainability topics are interrelated. You can't talk about the environmental topics without also talking about how those impacts affect people. You can't talk about how the industry affects people without talking about how people interact with the environment. So bringing that together and bringing all of that expertise across from the entire industry, from our Indigenous peoples that are engaged with us and the civil society organization, is a huge amount of effort, but gives us also a huge amount of opportunity, because there aren't a lot of places in the world that all of those people sit at the same table. And we measure a lot about kind of the impacts that our certification has. But I'd also say that one of the things I've seen through my career is there's a huge impact in just having the discussion. I've been at, and not just at ASI, but I've been at the table many times where for the first time it was Indigenous people sitting at the table with industry people, where there was an equal voice, and where they were having a discussion that was perhaps not a fight over a specific facility or a specific operation. So it was actually a values-based discussion. And I've seen many times where having all of those people at the same table has resulted in a more values-based outcomes versus a positional type of discussion. So we talk a lot about the impacts of certification, but one of the things that's been interesting to me over the course of my career is the impact of the discussion itself. And I don't see a lot of other places in the world where you get to have that discussion. We don't measure that. I don't know anyone that does measure that, but it's really been interesting to me over my career to have seen that. So in terms of standards, we have 2. I've talked a fair amount about the performance standards. So that says, you're going to have free, prior, and informed consent from Indigenous peoples on new facilities. It says your carbon emissions are going to look like such and such. It says you're going to have a complaint resolution mechanism, and it's going to be transparent. There are 69 or 59 different criteria in there. I should know that off by heart, but there's a lot of different criteria in there that outline the practices companies have to keep. And then how we manage that is in terms of creating this link through the system is through the chain of custody standard. So the performance standards talks about all of the on-site things that a company is going to manage. The chain of custody standards connects one company to the next company in terms of being able to track that material. I'd mentioned a couple of the things that we look at, but we broke it down in terms of some of the huge issues in this industry. These were decided from the very beginning back in 2009 when we started. But we're looking at everything from biodiversity management. It's a huge topic for us at the mining site. All the way through, like I said, material stewardship. So, what can a company do downstream that increases the recyclability of its products so we have less mining? So we're looking at all of those issues plus either 55 or 65 more, depending on how you do the math there. One of the things, and I'm only going to talk about it briefly here, one of the things that's really interesting in certification, I think after the fact, it took me a long time to really get interested in chain of custody, but it has a huge impact in terms of how you measure this material going through the system. ASI had two different systems when we launched in 2017. We were looking both at credits, so a company, and only in the very downstream, you couldn't use credits if you were mining, for instance, because mining, refining, smelting, we decided all of those facilities had to be certified. But if you were post-smelting, post-cast house, you could use a credit system where it was a one-time transfer of a volume of material without a physical transfer. So a company could give another company the credit of ASI. It was really limited, and right now we're looking at phasing that out. There wasn't any uptake in that system. It also has the least amount of integrity in terms of market value, because we're not actually saying there's any connection between the product and what happened. It's just a credit. So there's not a lot of uptake in the market. We might be phasing that out. We use a mass balance approach. So essentially companies have to track their volume. If I'm Krista Smelting, I have to track how much ASI material came in. And then if that was 20% of whatever I sell can be ASI material. We don't do segregation, which is kind of the last bit, which is this atom that I bought is the one I'm going to sell to you. And I think that had a really big piece of why there was a lot of uptake in ASI. Segregation is really difficult, especially in metals and mining. It's expensive, it costs a lot, and there's not actually any truly huge value, because as long as you have the impact on the ground, in my opinion, you're having the impact on the ground. If you're asking, from my perspective, if I'm going to say, okay, ASI company, you have to do something, I also want to say, what's the impact for that? So if I say you're going to spend, X dollars tracking the atom through the system, what's the benefit to that? Versus can you say, you're going to take those dollars and you're going to have a mine rehabilitation plan, or you're going to invest in biodiversity somewhere. So there's all these trade-offs. We kind of went middle of the road, mass balance, but I think that's a piece of why our certification system has been successful. You asked me to talk about harmonization. We are one of, I don't know how many standards out there. We harmonize with other standards. I said earlier that we work with the London Metals Exchange. They've just adopted a requirement for their members to do Oecd due diligence on all aluminium coming through the London Metals Exchange. We've harmonized our standard so it matches their standard. So sometimes we do that, which means we have actually a working group that looks at all of the standards that are relevant. And I'll get feedback from that working group that says, this standard is important. They talk about needing and this is just it's not a real example, but they say the complaints resolution mechanism has to be public in order for us to align with such and such an organization. I'll say, okay, I write that I have a log of hundreds of items like this and other things people say that we should include in our standards. I take it to our standards committee, and not quite often, we'll change the wording in our standard to align with another standard. Equally, we look at other standards and say, oh, you have the same wording as us. If our member has an ISO certification, we'll recognize that, and looking at complaints resolution, if it's exactly the same and our member has an ISO certification, they don't have to demonstrate to our auditors the complaints resolution criteria. So we do it both ways. Sometimes we match them, sometimes they match us, and we recognize that. We also work with other organizations, just through sharing information and learning. So we work through Icl. I would say probably every month, every 2 months, I personally will have a discussion with another organization about what they're doing, how they're solving a certain problem. So there's a lot of that sort of work behind the scenes as well that isn't formalized in any document, but where we're all trying to learn together. Yeah, so that's kind of the standard side of thing. The last thing I wanted to show you was our monitoring and evaluation. I'm going to jump to our website for that. I think, is it going to show? That's not showing up for you, is it?
It's showing up. We can see the website. Yeah, it's smaller screen, but you can see it.
Okay,
yeah,
perfect.
we can see it.
It doesn't show on my screen that you can see it. But as long as you can see it, that's good. So I wanted to go to our website rather than copying and pasting all of this in, so you can see how we report the data and come back to it if you want. It's always evolving. Our monitoring and evaluation program is bigger than what we're currently reporting on, when we're reporting on more all of the time. We report in many different ways. This is one of the ways. So this is our dashboard. It's updated, I think, monthly, but sometimes the idea is that it'll be updated in real time, but we don't have that level of integration yet. But you can see kind of some of our stats. So 162 members, 81 performance standards, 40 countries. We talk about how many different auditing firms we have, how many different auditors we've trained, kind of as different metrics of our success in terms of implementing the standard. We track how many people are working at ASI certified standards. And one of the next things that we want to be able to report on is how many of those are men versus women, because there is a significant difference in that number over time. So we want to be able to break that down. So you can see, we've been tracking the numbers since the beginning of our time, but we don't have the data compiled yet. But so then you can start to see some of those, versus kind of the implementation type of numbers. Are we having any impact type of numbers? So we think by having more certifications that we're going to have impact. We're going to start reporting on like what are those impacts, so that you can see over time. Oh yeah, when ASI started at ASI facilities, 20% of the workforce was women. This next round of revisions, I think we're revising the standard in a way that's really positive for gender inequity. So it'll be really interesting to see if that has any change in this ratio over time. That's all stuff that we're planning to measure and report on. It's just, we're still rolling that out. So there's this on our website. You can find all of this under outcomes and impacts. We also, every month, we're expanding out this section where we report more in depth on one of those numbers. So we have kind of like little mini reports that we publish monthly. This bit here, our story of change series. Our director of monitoring and evaluation has gone out to companies and done stories about some of the things that they have done as a result of their ASI certification, and it's the story of change at that facility. So they're kind of one of my favorite things versus, you know, a number. You can see the impact that ASI had at a certain facility. So there's that piece that we report on. And there's one more piece that I wanted to show you for those people who really like numbers. So we kind of go from the high level to, you know, a really much more in-depth level. Last year we did an in-depth piece on our GHG emissions from all of our members, and we're going to repeat that this year. So this report here, you know, it's one thing to say, oh, we have 80 certificates and that was, you know, therefore we're successful. We're actually working on gathering the data behind all of that. So this report here was compiled by an independent consultant and shows all of the data behind the greenhouse gas emissions of our members. So if you really are interested in that sort of stuff, we have, you know, the really in-depth data available, and we're expanding that out. We're just about to do a similar type of report on biodiversity and Indigenous people and complaints resolution. So every year we're kind of growing this database of information and repeating what we've done last year. So, you know, whatever the outcome was last year in terms of emissions, you can see that, and then you can see it over time as we go through time. So kind of the spectrum of different types of monitoring and evaluation to see if we do have any impact, because it's really nice to say that we have a great standard and it looks good on paper, but unless there's actually any impact, you know, and you can show the connection between the two, it's really just you know, an exercise in writing on our computers. So we really do bring it full circle with the monitoring and evaluation. So I just had one more slide in terms of a summary of what I thought was leading to the success of our program. The first that folks have always said is that the program was proactive rather than reactive. The industry came together with stakeholders to come up with a concept rather than responding to some sort of crisis. So it was proactive. It was multi-stakeholder from the beginning, which I think you can't say enough about how much that's necessary in certification. I talked a lot about the whole of supply chain approach, which having worked in different certifications, I am 2 feet in on the whole supply chain approach. It was a rigorous program development. I was there for some of it. They were busy times. It was tailored to the aluminum industry, which I think really made it successful because we could really drill down on the issues that were really specific to this industry. The uptake was business to business, and that was successful. We had some downstream members that were really interested in driving it. So having that kind of that market pull for the system. I worked in a certification system one time that there was no market pull. I don't work in that certification system anymore because it no longer exists. So if you don't kind of have the market recognizing the value of what you do, yeah, it's really hard to kind of get people to really care about making the changes you're asking them to make. And then there was a focus on innovation. Some of the harmonization stuff that we were doing, you know, I think we were one of the first certification systems to do that, you know, many years ago. So kind of trying to always make sure that we're looking for different ways to do what we do and do it better. So that's all I had for you.
Thank you so much, Krista. That's a great primer on ASI's work and also some of the structural aspects of certification. So I'm sure the students have questions as well. I had an immediate question around that slide you showed with the water can that you've got your first product. So this is something we were talking about in the class, was that, you know, ultimately certification systems can be a good mechanism also for comparisons if they are done in a way where you're comparing the different life cycle analysis criteria. And so I'm wondering how you would compare the plastics versus the aluminum in this case. I should note that many years ago, I did an LCA I was mentioning to the students where we looked at carbon fibers in helicopters and compared them to metal, including aluminum, but also titanium and other metals used. and the metals came out much better than the carbon fibers. Yep.
Yeah.
So that would be really helpful if you can tell us a bit more about this.
So we don't compare. Do we compare between products? We're certainly aware of it, but we're really also focused on this industry. So we're not. We're really not. Or not an advocating type of organization in terms of saying, use aluminium over plastics. At the same time, clearly we believe that aluminium is part of a more sustainable future, and hence kind of the vision and the mission. Each of our member companies is required to do an LCA of their product, so it's kind of inherently built in that way. But in terms of our role as an organization, I wouldn't say that we do that work. Others have done it for us. I think it's pretty, the case for aluminium is pretty strong from my perspective, my personal perspective, in terms of it being, part of a more sustainable future that is lightweighting of materials and providing that kind of infrastructure that we can go ahead with. So I think it's built in a couple of ways.
Okay, great. Yeah, and especially the circular economy bit, because the main problem with the carbon fibers was they were not recyclable at all. And of course, with metals, they are recyclable. So, okay, well.
And I come from a forestry background where the fibers degrade, and, it's like aluminum never degrades. You can use it a million times,
yeah,
and it's the same atom, right? So it really is. You have to look at each product separately as well, right? You can't, if I was to build a certification system for plastics, it would be different again, because each fiber is going to, or each material is going to be different. But I think for aluminum, this one makes sense.
Great, thank you, Krista. So, okay, let's open it up to the students for questions.
Yeah, I have a question. So earlier on in the presentation, you had a chart regarding your partner organizations by country and the amount of certifications, I think. It doesn't, we don't need to see maybe over another slide.
One more,
Yeah. So I was wondering, because you get all these different countries, what's some of the governance obstacles that ASI faces when working with all these different countries? Because it is fascinating to see China and Germany and then US sitting at 4. And I'm just wondering, are there any governance obstacles that ASI faces that maybe there's a better way to go about it? I'm trying, my personal interest is mineral supply chains here in the US and trying to make that more of an issue of sustainability here in the US. And I'm just wondering if there's obstacles that you hit between different countries that kind of make it difficult to work with a lot of different people with a lot of different beliefs on the mineral supply chain.
Yeah, you have no idea. Yeah, the answer is yes. So one of the things, and I'd thought to mention it and then had forgotten, you had mentioned about China. Half of the world's aluminium travels through China at some point. So it was recognized early on in ASI that we had to have a presence in China. Otherwise, it was going to be really difficult for us to get the system off the ground, because you can't be missing half of the supply chain entirely just from the get-go. So we had, I think, for 2 years as one of our strategic goals, expansion into China. We have a special advisor in China. We have staff in China. Our AGM last year was supposed to be in China. We work closely with Chinese members. We have a board working group dealing with China that specifically addresses issues that might be different for Chinese, and so that we can and not accommodate them, because the standards are the same around the world, but hear the different voices and make sure that we're building a standard that is implementable around the world. China is one region, but you look at the Middle East around human rights issues. It's you run into these problems kind of everywhere. It's in part, well, I wonder if in governance, it's a little bit governance, because of course our governance sets up our structure. It's really important in terms of standards, because we have to make sure that our standard is implementable around the world. For instance, we have a criteria on freedom of association, not a thing that's actually allowed by law in some parts of the world. So we kind of we have a part of that clause that says, if freedom of association is limited by law, the company can do X instead, right? So they don't get a get out of jail free card. They have to do something, but we recognize that they can't have freedom of association. We've similarly worked with folks. We've had meetings with folks in the US, what are the barriers there in terms of uptake? And sometimes it's culture, sometimes it's learning, sometimes it's supply chain, different countries, different things, different approaches.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess, the main reason I ask it is because, there's a lot of stuff that I'm looking at sometimes, I guess, through my personal research and stuff. Are always looking at China because there's such a huge portion of the market, as you mentioned. Yeah. I'm just wondering if companies and these certification programs are meeting obstacles by the US because there's all this great power competition going on. And I just wonder what impact that has on some of these companies down the supply chain that are focused on sustainability, but then there's this broader government to government issue that sometimes unfortunately overshadows some of those things.
Yeah, I don't feel like it's government to government. I think maybe for us, it was, and I'm speaking just from opinion here, I'm thinking I think our origins were much more European than North American. So I think that's part of our story. And then I think the focus on China because of that. So I think that we'll see it level out over time. We have we've had, I think if you looked at this chart a few years ago, there would have been very little US presence compared to even what there is now. So I think it's changing over time. I think it had a lot more to do with our origin than anything government to government.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
Indeed. Okay.
I had a question about the expansion and growth of your stakeholders. I think you had a slide on it where it was breaking it down over the years.
Of the stakeholders. I think maybe more on our website we did.
It was the bar graph that separated it in terms of growth by industry and how many people. I think it's the one above that.
Oh, this one.
Yeah. So have you seen increasing, have you seen that you have to reach out to industry more and more, or specifically industry, the red color, or have you seen them start to reach out to you in terms of this is a certification that they want? It's become a lot easier for you to push this since you guys are growing. That makes sense.
So both, I would say. And both the dark blue at the bottom and the red are industry for us. So we break it down into, part of our governance was recognizing that industry was not holistic and was actually quite the needs of production and transformation. So everything up to a cast house versus the downstream manufacturing was quite different. So we broke them into two different groups in terms of governance, and they sit proportionally at the table as equals. So it's in terms of our standards committee, production, transformation, industrial users, and CS, they're balanced. They're 6 each, and then we have 12 civil societies. So we've divided the industry into half so that we have equal representation. We did have initiative where I think last year, the year before, we worked actively on growing that red piece. I think the growth in the production and transformation has occurred more naturally on its own. The red bit, we worked actively to grow it. And it goes back to that piece that I said earlier, that if you don't have market demand, I feel you don't have a certification system. And so there was kind of this recognition that you needed to have that downstream pull to drive the uptake and to make it beneficial for people to invest the time and the money in certification. So it was both. That being said, we did think that we would be really hard hit last year, and it's not exactly what I do because I'm really focused on the standards. I think a lot of last year's growth occurred naturally.
Because I was going to say, especially once you get it up and running, it seems like other companies and your reputation would go to the point that other companies in the industry would realize that it can be beneficial. So it would just end up running itself.
And it starts to create its own internal poll. One of our members who's downstream had said everybody who supplies to them has to be ASI certified. And that's not something we require. But as soon as a company requires that, then everything downstream has to become certified, or upstream has to become certified. So yeah, it does start to grow itself. And then we just have to hang on for the ride.
Great. Tabin, yes.
Yes, I think was going to focus on the funding aspect of it, because throughout the presentation, she did not talk much about how do they raise funding for the initiatives. Is it through membership dues? What is the situation with the competition in the industry? And then I think let me ask the same question that Professor Ali asked us the other day. Who certifies the certifiers? Who is doing the certification of companies that are involved in this industry to make sure that they are also sticking to standards?
Yep. So on the first, we are a membership-based organization. So all of our members have to pay a fee, but particularly the production and transformation industrial users members pay a significant fee to join ASI, and it's based on size. So size of annual turnover of the organization. So all of the funding for ASI itself comes from our membership fees. And I think, nail on the head, and I've worked in certification system where when I talk about the monitoring and evaluation, when I talk about the number of meetings we hosted last year, this doesn't happen in a vacuum. I've had friends say to me, oh, I think we should start a certification system for such and such. And I'm like, yeah, it's not just like something you do off, the corner of your desk in your spare time. It's really involved. So part of our governance structure was to have the funding built in through the membership fees. And the goal was that aside from paying for the audit, ASI provided what was needed. So, we pay, our auditor training is free to auditors. All of our training is online, free to everybody in the world. So as much as we can, we provide everything that the certification system needs through our membership, so that it's, the people who have the benefit of certification, have paid for the system itself. So, and I think your question's right on the money. Pun intended. The second bit about, can you remind me again? I had it at the time, but it slipped my mind.
The competition in the industry, and then the last one was who certifies certifiers.
Yeah, so that, interestingly enough, was my original job at ASI. We accredit our own auditors. So we have a procedure, of course, that is for auditor accreditation. They apply to us as an auditing firm, and we have a series of criteria that they have to meet in terms of both the auditing firm having the systems and resources, but then the individual auditors also having the expertise and knowledge to do an ASI certification or do an ASI audit. And then on top of that, we have both initial training and ongoing training. So at one point, there were 3 standards, and one of them was standards of learning. It was my original role here. So equally, we developed the learning program at the same time as everything else, and it made it free and available to everyone. So we do that all internally in-house ourselves, and it's ongoing. Our manager of learning now develops new modules. It slowed down a little bit in revisions, but probably almost monthly. So we'll recognize that, perhaps we recognized last year that there was a problem with the public headline statements. So the piece of the report that was public, we wrote a training module and required all of our auditors to provide a written answer to questions to make sure that it was implemented, and had that rolled out to try and fix that problem. This year, as part of our check, we're checking to see if if it fixed the problem. So kind of full circle that we did the training, we monitor to see if there's problems, and then we monitor to see if we fix them.
Right. And Krista, related to that, could you say a few words about the Icl Alliance itself and what role that plays in terms of the sort of certifying the certifiers?
That piece as well, yes. So for us, we wrote our system with Icl certification in mind. So that was always the plan from 2015. As soon as we had launched, we applied for Icl membership. And then we've now last year, I can't remember anymore, closed our last non-conformance so that we're a full member. So we participate both in that part. This year we had our assurance system audit. So that's not what I do. So our director of assurance went through that audit. He sent me 2 suggestions that Icl had for us that I should fix in the standards revision process. So there's kind of that ongoing learning piece where we learned from our Icl audits. We're going to improve our assurance manual as a result of that. So we have kind of that auditing piece that's ongoing. And then we actively participate in Icl like as a member. So when they had in-person meetings, we would go to the in-person meetings, but even online. One of the things I'm passionate about is gender. So I belong to their gender working group. You know, I learn a lot from the work they do on gender and certification and bring it back here. And then additionally, it's, you know, it's the relationship stuff that we're learning through our work. You know, we feed back through them to other members. So it's kind of a both.
Wonderful. Yeah, I'm just putting up this in the background for the students' benefit that Icl is basically an effort to try and establish this kind of entity which can coordinate and audit the auditors, so to speak, in some way as well.
Yeah,
okay.
It gets to be quite complex in terms of everybody trying to do the best, you know, kind of, you know, we want our auditors to do the best, and then, you know, Icl is trying to unify the certification industry to best practices. So that's, you know, considering it started out as an idea 30 some years ago, you know, I think it's pretty impressive how the concept has grown.
Yes, yep, absolutely. Great. Other questions? Anyone else? Kaloe or Taylor or Benjamin? Okay, then one more question from my end would be, so you said, you know, the European-centric origins of the organization being what they are. I mean, the history of aluminium, of course, I was telling them about the students about Alcoa and, you know, the history of Charles Hall and how the whole industry started in, you know, Ohio and upstate New York and all. Are there specific efforts in trying to raise that number in the US? What you have, the 4 facilities, what is the situation with the US? Because if there's anything we can do to help in that way too, we would be happy to.
So we have worked in the past in terms of meeting with US producers to see what the barriers are. And to be completely, I didn't do it. So I'm actually not sure what the barriers were that came out of that. In terms of certifying facilities, I think it's really like every company will make its own decision, right? So I think it's 2 things. It's supply chain, so it's where US Metal goes. But then it's also kind of in terms of a company's alignment as well in terms of their individual plans, right? So I wish I had more insights for you, but I don't. I can get them, but it just wasn't the work I was doing.
Can I follow up with that? I mean, do you think that recent efforts in the last couple of years for the US to kind of review its supply chain, do you think that maybe that will open up some doors from the US? Because there's a lot of people talking about re-looking at the supply chain, where everything's going, sustainability of that supply chain, all these different things. It's becoming kind of a political thing now in the US. And I'm wondering if that maybe will reduce some of those barriers as companies are trying to really assess that sometimes.
Yeah, and I don't think there are really any huge barriers, right? Because all the pieces are there in terms of, assessing conflict affected and high risk minerals in the US. Like a lot of the pieces are there. I think it really is, I think, and this is truly just my opinion without a lot of basis behind it. I think it's going to be supply chain. So like I said before, if there's market pull, then that'll drive the uptake, right? If there's no market pull for the producers in the US, there's going to be less reason for a company to spend the money to certify a US facility. So I think one is going to be the market pull. So that's, the manufacturing and producers. And to be honest, I don't know enough about the aluminium supply chain to know where American product goes, and I don't know that any. Well, maybe some folks know, I don't know. It's a hard thing to track. Like if you want to say, where does bauxite out of Guinea end up? It's a complicated answer. But I would say that would be the first thing, because companies will certify where it pays them to certify, where there's a benefit. I had a second point. Can't remember anymore what it was.
Oh, that's very good. And I think that point about the consumer's pressure is also interesting, because, the aluminum, it's less clear to the consumer where the product is coming from, and it's not as personal a product. Like if you're using an aeroplane, you don't really, like, who's going to go and check to see if it's aluminum is certified, whereas with diamonds or with gems, you're wearing it, it's a very personal thing, and people get more invested in it. So here your target, when you're talking about the pressure coming from, it would be like Coca-Cola. Someone at Coca-Cola is saying we need all
business to
ASI.
business.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think that's where the leverage points will be. And that'll be really interesting to see. And I was thinking of inviting someone from one of the major aluminum producers, aluminum consumers, like Coca-Cola, Pepsi, or Reynolds, or others. So those 4 facilities that you have, where are they along the track?
I'd have to look. I don't know off the top of my head. Yeah, I'd have to look. I don't know. Yeah.
So, sorry, we're being US centric, but we're trying to be helpful, that maybe we can raise the profile, because it was like, I was going to show that chart to my friends in the State Department and say, look, you are bemoaning China, and here you have 24 in China versus so that's really interesting.
And I do know for sure, I want to say we have a member that's a recycler. And so I know one of those 4 is Jupiter Aluminium, which is a recycler refiner in Chicago. I've been there. So I know one of the 4 for sure. I don't know the other 3.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Krista. You've been so generous with your time, and it's been great to have you. And as I said, you're welcome to continue if you like, or I know you have a busy day ahead.
I do have to leave. I have another appointment. I would have liked to, but.
Yep, Tyler is here, so you can say hello to him. I don't know if you know each other, Tyler, but Krista is with the Aluminium Stewardship Initiative. She was our first speaker. So.
Yes, of course. I know Fiona very well. Hi, Krista.
Yeah, good to meet you, Tyler.
Yes.
Okay. It's interesting group. I think you'll have a good discussion, Tyler. It was truly my pleasure. I appreciate your questions. It makes me look at it a little bit different too. So thank you all.
Thank you, Krista. Great. Thank you. All right. Welcome, Tyler. So it's really a pleasure to welcome Tyler Gillard to our class as our next guest speaker. And Tyler has had a distinguished career with OECD. He has been there since 2009, if I take it right from your bio. And he has been involved in due diligence work in various capacities, and now is essentially leading the OECD's entire due diligence operation in supply chains. And I did give the students a quick primer on OECD before, Tyler, but certainly it may come up as well in the question specifically. Tyler's training is in law. He has an LLM from Columbia Law School in New York, and previously studied at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London as well. And so he's going to give us the sort of panoramic view of the work that the OECD is doing around responsible mineral supply chains, and some really exciting new efforts underway. We had a call with his team last week, and it was really great to see that they're using new technologies. They're doing so much innovative work also to drive this agenda forward on behalf of the 37 member states of the OECD. So Tyler, welcome, over to you. Would you like to use your computer, or you? I think it'll be easier if you can use yours, because then you have more control.
Yeah, let me just take a moment to just share my screen and then I'll just get started. Can you all see that?
Yes.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Salim. Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. And I know you guys are, I know you got a primer already on the OECD work and probably sleeping with our standards under your pillows at night. But I thought maybe what I would do was run through some of the issues, which I think you're very familiar with, then give you a bit of a deep dive into our standard. And then particularly given this class, I don't have time to sort of introduce all the work we're doing, but I wanted to focus on one area which really relates to mineral certification. And we're right now trying to do a process to sort of make sense of the sort of hodgepodge and alphabet soup of certification programs that exist out there in this space. And so I'll focus on that, but I also really look forward to your comments and feedback. It's a lot of text on these slides. I'm also happy to send these for reference, but I think it's important to start with this so that we're all in the same understanding that, of course, at the outset, minerals are a source of growth, jobs, revenues, also for the transition to a green future are going to be even more critical than ever before. But we also know that the mining and trade of resources can be associated with a number of quite severe human rights or illicit activity, whether that's issues around informal and artisanal mining, community relations, terrorist or conflict financing. This is a global issue. A lot of press focuses on specific regions and even as well, particularly in Central Africa, but is not something that's limited or geographic specific. You find these types of issues almost globally across the world to differing extent. And it also affects various kinds of mineral resources. Gold and tin, tantalum, tungsten, those are called the 3 Ts, have come under specific global scrutiny, and we have some specific standards for that, but it's not, again, specific to those resources. We find these types of risks associated with cobalt, with coal mining, and even with oil and gas to different degrees. The way that it affects artisanal mining, ASM and LSM, also differs, but I want to highlight that both sources of mining are a source of risk according to the OECD. I'm going to skip through this, but this gives you just a quick sense. There's also a lot of international global attention on the issue from a sort of security and terrorist financing perspective. The UN Security Council since 2009 has issued more than 10 Security Council resolutions. So if you know anything about international law, the Security Council has the power to issue binding resolutions, so binding international law on all states. And they are increasingly concerned with the role that minerals play in financing sanctioned individuals and entities. And again, this shows everywhere from these, by the way, these are not all Security Council resolutions because there aren't resolutions on Colombia, for example, but these are just examples of the benefit from the mining and trade of mineral resources. So whether that's through having beneficial or other ownership interests in mines, to illegal taxation, rackets at mines or export routes, all the way through to very complex money laundering and terrorist financing regimes. So you see the whole ambit affecting minerals in different ways. Now, importantly, when you look at the landscape, what you see, what 10 years ago was rather a piecemeal landscape, has now been kind of stitched together into a sort of more clearer global picture of requirements. Now, again, these government legislation has really stepped up in the last 10 years, and it really started in the United States with Section 1502 of the Dodd-Frank Act, which was focused on 3T and gold, tin, tantalum, tungsten, and gold out of Central Africa exclusively. But since then, we've seen a real increase in legislation from the European Union in 2017, which came into effect this year, but also in producing countries like the DRC and Colombia and Uganda, where they have requirements for sort of due diligence requirements on the source and chain of custody of minerals before they are exported. Also in the European Union, a new battery regulation, the new battery directive is being updated. This is a regulation that lays out quality specification for battery metals in Europe. They are now revising it to include responsible sourcing expectations for key battery metals. So that will include copper, cobalt, nickel, tin, etc. Now, where there are gaps in the regulatory outlook, you see that actually industry requirements are sort of filling that gap. And what do I mean by that is that a lot of the major metal exchanges worldwide are now adopting requirements on responsible sourcing in order to protect their markets from legal and reputational risks. So some of this was driven by Dodd-Frank in the 3T and gold sector, but now you see moves, for example, from like the London Metals Exchange, which is responding purely to commercial pressures, because issues around child labor and cobalt were actually driving prices down on the exchange. So basically off exchange trading, we're getting a premium because those parties were able to address child labor risks. So for commercial reasons, you see a lot of this being driven as well beyond simply the legislative kind of drivers that you've seen on this. I'm going to skip this for the sake of time, but this is just summarizes a little bit of that patchwork that I was talking about, where in red you see some of the legislative initiatives, and in gray and black you see some of the different industry requirements. This gives you a sort of just a map of the different commitments that you see. So in blue, you see our countries that have on the books and in force now mandatory requirements on mineral supply chain due diligence. So this would require the users of those metals or the importers of metals, depending where you are, to undertake due diligence in line with our standard, which I'll get into. The green here are sort of political commitments or cover also industry requirements. So you have industry requirements at exchange for gold exchanges in China, in Singapore, in Dubai, in London, in Chicago. And you have a large number of political commitments from many other countries in the globe, but these have still not been sort of translated into law yet. So with that background, and hopefully I'm not going too quickly for you all, I want to now give you a bit more detail on what the OECD guidance actually says. Before I'm going to finish a little bit on what this means for certification programs. So yeah, the OECD, first of all, it's important to start off as a multilateral organization. So our members are governments. There's 37 member governments that include all of Europe, all of North America, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, Israel, and a small handful of Latin American countries. Our governments came together over the course starting in 2008 and decided that they needed to provide a global standard to their businesses on how to source minerals responsibly from high-risk regions. Originally, this was very much driven by the conflict minerals issue in Central Africa. But importantly, our governments didn't want to limit it to simply Central Africa, because this was seen as a global phenomenon and a global challenge. So this guidance was developed over the course of 2 years through a pretty in-depth negotiation with business, with civil society, and with governments, and eventually then adopted. And it's called a guidance, but in a way it's a bit of a wrong naming for it, because it's actually a legal instrument of the organization. It's a standard. It's an international global benchmark. And that's certainly the way that we see it, that this is something that companies have a responsibility to implement, that they should be implementing. And so it's not really voluntary in our eyes. Now, governments, when they adopt this, make commitments to implement it through their promotional activities and, where relevant, through public policy and regulation. So what that means is that governments, when they adopt this, are not legally required to adopt regulation, but should they adopt regulation, they should use this standard, if that makes sense. So the OECD guidance essentially applies to companies from the mine all the way to the end consumer. So that's miners, that might be mineral traders and mineral ores and concentrates, that might be smelters and refiners of minerals and metals, it might be traders of metal products and metal exchanges, and it might be manufacturers and end user companies in the electronics, medical device, jewelry industries that use those metals. I'm going to go through a little bit of the detail of what the guidance actually says and does, but importantly, it applies to all minerals and all companies from mine to consumer, but it focuses on a very narrow set of risks. Now, we all know that mining and trade is also associated with a wide range of environmental impacts, with a wide range of labor impacts, beyond simply conflict financing and severe human rights abuses. This standard was designed to help companies prioritize the most severe types of risks you see in conflict zones. So while environmental impacts and labor impacts are severe and serious, they're not necessarily specific to a conflict zone or a high risk zone. The guidance has a general annex that defines what due diligence is. It has a model policy, which is in its Annex 2, which outlines the key risks and the responses to the risks. And it has a number of additional supplements for specific metals, like the 3 Ts and for gold. Importantly, it also has an appendix on artisanal small-scale mining that I'll explain in a minute. So what is due diligence actually? I've been using that term, but maybe it's useful to recall. Well, basically, it's about companies doing their homework, about them knowing what's in their supply chain and showing through public reporting that they're doing the right thing. From the OECD's perspective, this involves 5 key steps. The first step is companies are expected to establish strong management systems to support their due diligence. This means adopting a policy with clear commitments. It means collecting information. It means engaging with suppliers and putting conditions in your contracts. And it means setting up a grievance mechanism. And with those management systems, companies then are deemed to have the capacity and ability to then start to do the checks on their supply chains. The second step of due diligence is to identify, assess, and prioritize risks. Now, the way that companies meet this responsibility will differ drastically depending on where they sit in the supply chain, and I'm going to get into that. But whether they're a miner or a company like Apple, obviously what you do for due diligence to find risk is very different. The third step is to then manage the risks that are identified. That includes reporting to senior management, collecting more information, and most importantly, going on the ground to try to prevent and fix the problems, maybe through providing money or equipment, geological equipment or information to improve conditions, to set up monitoring schemes, to formalize payments to security forces. The fourth step is to support an audit at the refiner level. Now, the refiner and smelters are considered to be a critical choke point in the metal supply chain. That means that all mineral ores must pass and be refined before they can be used by downstream markets. So this creates a literal choke point in processing in the supply chain. Now, luckily, there's relatively few number of refiners and smelters that cover the vast majority of metal production. So if you look at gold, roughly 70 gold refiners cover more than 90% of refined gold production. If you look at tin or tantalum, the numbers are roughly the same. So by focusing on doing an audit of the sourcing practices of that refiner, you're able to catch a large amount of the supply chain. And downstream companies, oh, sorry, it's bedtime here in Paris, so sorry about that.
No problem. Thanks for staying up for us.
Of course. So downstream companies are expected to engage with that choke point in the supply chain, that smelters and refiners, and ensure that they're audited. So I'll explain what that is. Then the fifth step of due diligence is about public reporting. So, companies can't just say, hey, trust me, I've got this all under control. And auditing alone is not a sufficient kind of assurance mechanism to guarantee these things. There need to be a numerous amount of checks on companies. So one check, essentially there's 3 checks built into the OECD system. One check is the checks that suppliers do on that customers do on their suppliers. So customers need to check that their suppliers are doing the right thing. The second check is this audit of the choke point of that refiner smelter. And the third check is through public reporting and transparency. And that sort of assumes that by companies reporting on the risks they find and where they are in the journey, that regulators and the public will hold them to account. And you see that already, that we're actually just going to be putting out an analysis of how media and stakeholders have reported risk over the last 2 years. And you find an undue amount of reports focusing on the DRC. And partially that's because there's so much company reporting on the DRC related to 1502 of the Dodd-Frank Act. So more company reporting will generate more scrutiny, and that's what we want. Now, I mentioned, of course, the guidance applies to companies across the whole metal supply chain, from the mine all the way to the consumer. That's a really important component of the success of our work, because it ensures that the demand is translated up the supply chain and down the supply chain, and creating the sort of business incentives from a market access perspective to do the right thing. So if I participate in due diligence, I can access US and European markets, and I'll have secure relationships with my customers. But the way that companies meet that responsibility, how they do due diligence, of course, differs a lot, depending on whether you're a mining company or you're an electronics company. Roughly, our standard divides the supply chain into upstream and downstream. Upstream are companies from the miner to the smelter and refiner. So that will be mining companies, mineral ore traders and concentrate traders, and it'll mean smelters and refiner. Those are considered the upstream companies. Downstream companies are all the companies that come after the refiner in the supply chain. So that might be a metal trader on the LME, that might be a solder manufacturer, that might be a semiconductor manufacturer in China, or that might be Apple or Intel. Those are downstream companies. And what they do to meet their responsibility under those 5 steps differs a lot. Generally speaking, the upstream companies are expected to sort of establish traceability to the mine site. And for high-risk supplies, where they've identified specific red flags, they're expected to undertake on-the-ground assessments of the mines and the transportation routes, and adopt risk mitigation plans with local stakeholders to fix the problems. Now, companies don't necessarily need to do this alone. In fact, they are encouraged to collaborate with others to do these types of assessments and these traceability. Because of course, there could be a problem if you're a miner and you're selling to thousands of different companies in their supply chain, and each of those companies individually checks you. You could imagine that you could spend a lot of your time just responding to requests for information instead of mining properly. So it's really important that industry comes together to do these types of traceability and risk assessments at the mine site and the trading site all the way through export to reduce audit fatigue and increase the effectiveness. And that's where a lot of the certification and industry programs come to play, which I'll speak to. Now, downstream companies, whether electronics companies, for example, are not expected to know the mine of origin for all the metals in their products. That's practically impossible, given the nature and complexity of global supply chains. What they are expected to do, though, is identify the smelters and refiners of the metals in their products. And even that is sometimes a very challenging task for many companies. Because if you imagine a company like General Electric, we work, when we launched a pilot for this, they reported, and they report to the SEC on this, so this is all publicly available. They have 10,000 first-tier suppliers of products that contain 3T and gold. Each of those suppliers on average has 1,000 suppliers. And you have 5 of those tiers before you get to the smelter refiner in the supply chain. So that, once you do the math, that's an exponential growth at each tier in the supply chain, leading to tens of millions of companies in order just to find the smelter refiner. So it's no easy task, but I'm happy to report that companies are doing it, and largely driven by a lot of the legislative requirements in the US initially. So companies are expected to identify that choke point, the smelter refiner, and then collect information on whether those refiners are sourcing upstream like they should. Are they doing their responsibility with traceability and on-the-ground assessments? And they're expected to push those smelters to go through independent third-party audits. And of course, all companies are expected to then report. I wanted to spend a quick moment under the guidance to just note that we distinguish on the upstream side. I know you're probably a lot of experts on mining here, between what we call chain of custody and traceability. Chain of custody being a sort of system of documentation that provides certain information, and traceability being a process whereby issues can be traced to a specific mine and segregated. The type of information the OECD, we expect companies upstream to collect and share is the mine of origin, locations where metal is consolidated or blended, the method of extraction, artisanal small-scale mining, the weight and assayed quality characteristics of each transaction. That's the basic. Then for high-risk countries where there are red flags identified, additional information is expected, including the identify of all suppliers and sub-suppliers between the miner and refiner, information on all taxes, fees, and royalties paid to the government, any other payments made to government agencies for compensation for services, including to private for security services, and information on transport, how mine was transferred. Transportation routes themselves are not expected to be shared, given the security concerns that might arise, for example, in precious metals. If I say, on this date, $20 million in gold are going to be going down this route, that's a pretty big security concern. So as you can imagine, producers are not likely to share information on those transportation routes. As I said, the OECD guidance has a dedicated annex on artisanal and small-scale mining. That's because although artisanal small-scale mining might make up a smaller share of global production, anywhere from 10 to 15%, depending on the mineral ores, in some cases much smaller than that. From the OECD's perspective, they're a very important provider of jobs, an important source of development in rural areas. And the guidance was not designed with the intention of sort of cutting out smaller actors from the market, even though artisanal small-scale mining, which is largely informal, is particularly vulnerable to exploitation from criminal groups or armed groups and issues like child labor. Nonetheless, we have an annex, an appendix that expects companies to engage and support the formalization of artisanal small-scale mining rather than walk away. And it provides a detailed kind of roadmap on the different roles and responsibilities in that regard. So I think I have about 6 minutes. Whoops, I've been speaking maybe too long, but I wanted to talk about really a critical component, which is now that, we have this standard, okay, so what? What are we doing? Well, I would say the first 5 years, it was adopted in 2011. The first 5 years, we really focused on sort of let 1,000 flowers bloom. Let's try to get this out there, promote it, its adoption as wide as possible. We're still doing that, but now we've shifted into, okay, assessing the quality of implementation. Are companies doing it well? And where we've really started is by looking at a lot of the industry and due diligence programs. We don't necessarily call it certification programs because they're not always product certification or company certifications, but you could call it that to a certain extent. Now, we're not going to talk about all this. These are, but I wanted just to show you that, the landscape of certification or programs is very complex. All of these initiatives here, and actually some of this is a little bit out of date, they've changed their names, are based on or designed to operationalize these OECD requirements that I just walked you through. But before we started our work to assess the quality, these were all claims that they were implementing. No one was actually checking whether they were implementing OECD guidance. Importantly, the landscape of due diligence initiatives, well, let's call it due diligence initiatives, is vast and diverse. You have industry initiatives that are focused on specific geographies, like for example, in the DRC, or on specific issues, like artisanal small-scale mining or modern slavery. You have initiatives that are industry or multi-stakeholder that might be purely about auditing refiners, and you have initiatives that are more about doing risk assessments, grievance mechanisms, or traceability schemes. So there's a whole wide variety, and that's a good thing. I think there are different tools and needs for companies at different stages of the process or operating in different countries. But they all claim to be aligned with global standards. But the question, as I said, is, are they actually? So our governments decided that we needed to lead a process to assess these various programs and their alignment with our benchmark. And, alignment is really important because these initiatives are the practical multiplier for the implementation of our standards. In addition, if initiatives are not aligned, this creates additional cost in the system. So if I'm a company and I'm Apple, I don't have the time to spend to look at all the different certification initiatives and see how they may or may not overlap when 70% or 80% they overlap. So alignment is really critical. And if we come in and support the alignment with the global standards, that creates an easier way for them to start recognizing each other horizontally. So what is an alignment assessment and that by the OECD? It's essentially just an evaluation of a due diligence program, either led by industry or multi-stakeholder, to see whether their standards, so their written commitments, and the implementation of those standards actually meets OECD due diligence guidance. So as I said, this assessment that we launched looks at both the policies and the written codes for audit requirements, but we also do interviews and site checks to check whether they're implementing it in the ways that they say that they are. And I should note that we find huge gaps between what initiatives claim they are doing, what's written, and what is actually happening on the ground. And that might relate to major deficiencies in auditor quality. For example, it also just might relate to the fact that they want to promise the world, but in actual fact can only achieve a very narrow set of issues. We give a rating to these assessments, to these initiatives, not aligned, partially aligned, fully aligned. This is based off of around 300 different criteria, and each alignment assessment takes around 18 months. So we did a pilot assessment. We do this in a number of sectors. I'm only going to talk to you about minerals and mining in my 2 minutes I have left. We started with the 5 biggest programs in mineral supply chains, which is namely the Responsible Jewelry Council, Code of Practices, and Chain of Custody program. It's called CFSI here. It's now been renamed to the Responsible Minerals Initiative. It was CFSI when we did it. We also evaluated the LBMA, the London Bullion Market Association's Responsible Gold Program. We evaluated the Dubai DMCC, Dubai Multi-Commodities Responsible Gold Sourcing Program. And we evaluated Icl, which is the International Tin and Tantalum Supply Chain Initiative that's operated on the ground in DRC and provides traceability and mine site assessments. The process is very robust. I'm not going to go through all steps in the alignment assessment process, but it involves a document review of the standards, and it involves interviews with stakeholders and companies and members, as well as key stakeholders like civil society. It also involves shadow assessments. So we observe audits and checks that are being done by those programs. And then there's a process of working with improvement through the initiatives, because we're not here to sort of name and shame the initiatives. We actually want them to take their findings and make improvements. So we give them our preliminary findings. They would have 3 to 6 months to make changes to their standards, and then we reassess the standards based on that assessment. Of course, we can't reassess implementation because of that small time period, but we are now thinking about assessing a lot of those programs that we initially started off with. So if you look here, the results of the work that we did initially in the 5 big programs, when they first started off, only 2 of them were even partially aligned. And when we ended up in 2018, they all moved to partial alignment. So you can see in the light blue here was, and this is just the standards alignment score. This is not the implementation alignment score. But the standards alignment score and the light blue is their first 2016 assessment, and the dark blue is the improvements they made following the changes that they made. Now I can't show you that improvement, as I said, on implementation because we didn't reassess implementation. We've done 5, you can ignore the other sectors. Sorry, that's a holdover from a previous slide, but we've done 5 pilot assessments. We are now launching new assessments with the London Metal Exchange for base metals. That will include the copper mark, for example, and a number of other new initiatives, including the Aluminum Stewardship initiative that you just heard about. And we also have a specific role in the EU regulation on conflict minerals. So the EU regulation on conflict minerals foresees that the EU would recognize due diligence programs that are deemed to meet the obligations and help companies meet their obligations under the Act. We have a specific role, the OECD, in providing an opinion to Europe on whether they came to the right conclusions in that process. So all to sum up that, these programs are the key implementer for our standards, but somebody needs to make sense out of them because the market itself is not very good at making sense of it. Why is the market not very good at making sense of it? Because the drivers are naturally fragmented. You have investors, you have specific buyers in different geographies that want different things. Some are focused on green finance, some are focused on child labor. That diversity and fragmentation makes it very difficult for industry to coalesce around one standard globally, certification standard that they can implement. So, but the view is, as I said, is that if they all align vertically with the international benchmarks, that will create better consistency horizontally as well, if that makes sense. And with that, here's some links to the information that I shared, and happy to have a discussion. Over to you,
Wonderful.
Salim.
Thank you so much, Tyler. You covered such a lot of ground in 30 minutes. We really appreciate that. So I'm sure the students will have some questions, but I wanted to start off the discussion with the point that I was very pleased to hear that you made about how this new, well, it's not so new, but relatively new effort to try and make sure that the standards usage is being properly aligned. The alignment assessments is underway. What is the challenge that you face in terms of these alignment assessments that you may want to reflect upon? Because some of these initiatives, so for example, like Aluminium we just heard from, they are operating in non-OECD countries also. They are developed with a very different set of priorities in mind. Like with the Aluminium one, we heard that they are their second largest country, which has uptake is China. So how do you figure that out in terms of your OECD members versus the non-members who are very important? And OECD is a post-war institution with its own idiosyncrasies, which may not be necessarily aligned with reality currently in geopolitics. So how do you navigate that space? Like there's also the G20, you have all these other entities which are moving forward.
It's a good question. And I mean, it's not easy, but I think, it's a bit, well, a lot of it has to do, I was going to say it seems a bit like a lame answer, but it's true. A lot of it has to do with how inclusive we are in developing and pushing these out. So yes, this has an OECD logo on it. I wish it didn't, because actually, for example, Central African countries were there at the table from the get-go and negotiating this with us. And in fact, their heads of state from 12 Central African countries actually endorsed this standard and put it into a certification program before OECD members did. Similarly, we've worked very closely with China and very closely with India. And that's why on that global map, you see China and India, they've actually committed to this standard, either through nationally developed frameworks that we worked with them to develop. So if it's politically not palatable for China to adopt an OECD framework, what we do is we work with the Chinese industry to adopt a Chinese due diligence standard, which is fully aligned with the OECD framework, but also adapted to their characteristics. And that's what happened in China. So in 2015, China adopted its due diligence guidelines for responsible mineral supply chains. It uses the same 5-step framework, the same risk issues, but it's just called Chinese one. And that's fine for us. That's actually good. We've done the same thing with India in gold. So it's a lot of work. It's a lot of going out there. At the same time, I would say that, OECD countries and consuming markets fully have the right to decide what types of issues they do or don't want their products associated with. So it's not exactly an extraterritorial application of law to say, well, look, I don't want my electronics associated with child labor and conflict. That's their companies and the goods that are sold on their markets. Now, by virtue of that, supply chains are globally interconnected, but those requirements are market requirements now. Luckily, I think we're now in a space where that political issue you touched on, at least in minerals, is kind of no longer there. I think globally, the OECD guidance is now accepted as a global standard. I think it's not, the political issue is not really a problem. What I think perhaps is a more relevant issue is that the risks that we focus on are probably not the most material risks in all metals. I mean, in aluminum, for example, you do have, for example, some bauxite mining that is involved in criminality and child labor, but largely with aluminum issues have to do with land for bauxite mining and environmental impact for the production of aluminum. I mean, there's more issues, right? And that's not in our standard right now, although I should say that we're going to go through a process to reflect on that. And the way that we address that now is to say, look, this is the floor, not the ceiling. So Aluminum Stewardship Initiative, while not designed in most material, because it's not material and it doesn't affect you, it should be actually rather easy to incorporate these requirements into your initiative. But it's important for investors and downstream users, because if I'm Apple, I'm using all these metals. I don't distinguish between necessary, and I just need assurance across the board. So it's important that there is a floor that's common. Now, whether the ceiling, the floor meaning no child labor, no forced labor, no conflict, in the issues, of course. Now, the ceiling, and whether we're talking about, green production or land issues, that might differ, and maybe we still need to move there. But at least we need a common benchmark sort of floor. And I think we've got there. I admit that the move by the London Metal Exchange was a particular, I think, multiplier and a catalyst for the base metals now starting to pay more attention. Our work was used to be confined into 3T and gold, which are quite unique. But the move by the LME, which is the largest metal exchange worldwide, was a major catalyst, I think, for uptake in copper, cobalt, aluminum.
Indeed. Great, thank you. All right, let's open it up to the students then. Who would like to go first?
Yeah, going back to your last statement, first off, thank you very much for coming to speak with us today. Really appreciate it. What time is it there? Really?
8:40.
Okay, yeah. Well, definitely appreciate you doing that then. I did want to ask, going back to your last couple of statements there about gold and 3Ts, why, I know that there was some push by the RMI to have Cobalt into the Dodd-Frank, where does that stand? Like, why did Cobalt not get included into that? And then a kind of follow-up question is that, USGS has critical minerals, you hear of conflict minerals, And then as I always bring up, we always talk about minerals, but in reality, we're talking about elements, right? Because the minerals and the ores are something completely different. So as someone who has a geology background, I sometimes am thinking, if I'm looking for mineral deposits, I'm thinking about ores and the actual minerals they make up, not elements. If you tell me to find cobalt, that can be a little confusing for me versus finding cobalt and, you know, different things like that. So those are kind of two questions that I have so far.
So should I take it one-on-one, or how do you, yeah?
Yeah, I think let's do that.
Well, I mean, I would say that the cobalt boom really only started in around 2015, 16. I mean, of course, cobalt was being mined as a byproduct for centuries, you know, for a long time. But, you know, the real demand, the real spike in demand for cobalt came after the legislation on conflict minerals. So there was no focus. And I mean, that what that means is that artisanal miners, while they were involved in cobalt mining, it wasn't as lucrative to them because prices were very, very low. So the issue, the widespread issue of child labor, while it probably was happening, wasn't as widespread as you see it now with the demand of cobalt and prices where they are. So, you know, in 2010, when Dodd-Frank was introduced, that wasn't even on the radar yet. Now, with the EU legislation, which was adopted in 2017, it very much was. And EU was under a lot of pressure to include cobalt. At that point, the European Union was more focused on, well, let's ensure that we're covered with the US, the same metals, before we go out to new metals. They were a little bit, I think, cautious about introducing new requirements in metals when they didn't really know what the implications would be. But they inserted a review clause into the EU legislation, which means basically actually next year already, the EU has to start a review of whether to include other metals, minerals, ores, elements into its regulation. I mean, I can't speak on behalf of the EU, but I would say it's very likely that they would consider cobalt in this next round of issues. In the United States, the Secretary of State actually has the power to review and designate additional metals to be conflict minerals. At the OECD, first of all, we don't use the term conflict minerals. I don't think it's a helpful term. There's nothing about the metal that is particularly conflicted. It's the way that they're mined and traded in specific areas. But in the US, the three TGs are called conflict minerals. Now, the Secretary of State in the US can designate additional metals to be conflict minerals, but that's only when the metals are used to finance perpetrators of human rights abuses. In the situation of cobalt, it's a little different. You have informality, terrible working conditions, and child labor, but you don't have armed groups at the mine sites in DRC. And I think for the Congolese, it's also a bit of a perennial source of discomfort to sort of saying everything's being tarred with the same brush, and it's really not. So cobalt is rather different. It's also largely mined through industrial mining, unlike the 3Ts in Eastern Congo. Your point on terminology, like we don't use conflict minerals. We also don't have like a criticality list. You know, we leave that to Europe and the US. I think these issues, though, by the way, are very important for critical raw materials, though, I should say, because they do affect security of supply and access as well. Whether we use ores, I mean, it's true that the geologists don't like it, maybe, but most of our readers are not geologists. You know, most of our readers are people in companies that, you know, don't know a lot. I mean, if you're a procurement person in Intel, you don't understand the whole thing about ores and byproducts and this, that, the other, slags and all these terms, and you don't. So I think we try. I mean, I say plain language. We're not very good at using plain language because this is all negotiated language, but we use minerals because that's the more plain language use of the term, I think.
Thank you, Tyler. While we're on the cobalt issue, I'll just ask another question, and while the others are thinking for more, I'm sure they have others too. But as you know, deep sea mining has become a big contentious issue also. And one of the rationales being presented, especially for cobalt, is that you have so many problems on terrestrial sources of minerals and metals. And I was wondering if you have been involved in any of those conversations. I have noticed that you're having a side event with the WEF at the OECD forum. And so just a question about the future of deep sea mining and the OECD.
It's uncertain, I would say. This will be the first event, and it's even a side event that we've done on it. So I unfortunately don't have a real answer for you. I think it's of serious concern, and I think, thinking about what a just transition means, responsible transition. Do we do it at the cost of our oceans or at the cost of child labor in order to source more metals for battery? I think these are very serious issues for policymakers right now. I will say that it kind of relates to some of the other points I made, that I think we are now taking seriously whether we need to revise the OECD guidance to include a wider set of issues, given some of the issues that we've already spoke about, materiality and, environmental impacts being also very significant. Now, this is, as you can imagine, quite tricky for a standard that's used in law, because our members don't want to see us sort of backdoor changing their laws by changing the underlying standard that's referenced in the law. So, the SEC, the US Securities Exchange Commission, referenced the OECD guidance as the standard for implementing Section 1502. They didn't say OECD guidance edition 1 from 2011. They just said OECD guidance. So if we then go and change and expand the scope, are we de facto also changing then US law without the proper processes that would involve? So it is very delicate, unfortunately, for us, but I think it's critical now with these discussions on deep sea mining and a broader attention around renewables and critical materials that we provide, that our standard is fit for purpose and is not left behind there. But I'm sorry, we haven't done work on deep sea mining yet.
Okay, no, thanks for that. Okay, other questions?
Going off what you were just saying, do you think altering your standards might change the alignment assessments of different participants in your?
It would, for sure. We'd have to redo. Likely what we would do, I don't know, but we would probably be given the role of this in the regulatory space, we would probably maintain the current scope and then somehow add additional annexes or supplements for a wider scope of issues, so that we could still delineate between the kind of narrow conflict and high risk scope and then the broader responsible mining scope. But certainly if we expanded the scope, then our alignment assessments, we would need to redo that with that broader scope. I don't think it would change the current scope, obviously, but we would need to relook at those things. And a lot of these initiatives at the smelter refiner level are still really focused on the OECD scope right now. So a lot of the RMI, they're not looking at whether the minerals are produced, in an environmentally friendly manner using best available techniques for chemicals and water management. That's not even in the radar of the smelter refiner audits.
Indeed, thank you. Others, Tabin Yang, did you want to say something? I thought, wasn't sure.
Yes, I think
So Tabin Yang, for your background information, Tyler is from Cameroon, and so he's very familiar with the Central African context overall. But yes, go ahead, Tabin Yang.
yes, I was just going to try to find out. What's that? That we jump from the upstream to the downstream. Is it a midstream? Is that where you have the choke point?
Yeah, the smelter refiner is sometimes people call it the midstream, indeed. Yeah.
Yeah, that's more a semantic issue, but one of the things with that, where you call it, in fact, that's the real choke point, and a lot of those areas are where you went through where there can be this dynamic going in different directions. What are some of the technological tools that can be utilized when you were saying you've got so many thousands of companies that become involved? And so could you give us like an example of how that might be managed?
Practically?
Yeah.
It's very different depending on if you're upstream or downstream. If your aim is to collect, so, you know, these downstream companies like, you know, Apple, Intel, Motorola, all these companies, you know, they don't know, they're not able, they know the smelters and refiners in aggregate in their supply chain, but they don't know for each product which smelter refiner is in each specific product. And that's because they use a sort of way, which is really important, of collecting information and then aggregating at each stage in the supply chain. So what happens is every supplier in downstream fills out the same template. That information is on suppliers and known smelters for those downstream companies. That all funnels into a secure online system that sort of aggregates it and spits it out to companies to say, on aggregate, here's the list of smelters in your supply chain. And that's really important because many downstream companies, particularly those that are very close to the smelter, would consider giving up their supplier names, giving up their commercial and competitive trade secrets, essentially. So they don't want to give out the trade secrets and tell specific supplier relationships, but they're happy to pass on in aggregate the smelter names that they're sourcing from. So there's a tool that's also been developed by the RMI that essentially, like I said, is a reporting template that downstream companies use. All the information is fed into a kind of system that's protected. And I'm not a crypto person, so I can't speak to its protections, but presumably very secure. It hasn't been hacked yet. And that info that aggregates the smelter is then spit out to a dashboard to downstream users. So that's like to collect information in aggregate on specific entities in my supply chain. But that's not traceability or chain of custody. For traceability or chain of custody, the upstream side, you have a whole range of technologies being used. Of course, you know, for a while, blockchain was like everyone was talking about blockchain and everyone wanted to develop a blockchain. And, you know, we think that blockchain has a role, obviously, because a cryptographic mechanism for protecting information, but you still have the sort of garbage in, garbage out problem, and that you still require sort of boots on the ground to log the information, you know, to make sure that it's accurate before it's sort of put onto the blockchain. But you have loads of blockchain initiatives now that are designed for traceability purposes to the mine.
Yeah, we may be talking to Everledger and, you know, to give the students some insights into that. But, you know, in my work with the UN, with the Global Environment Facility, we found that many times the GEF applications for grants for blockchain usage are totally unnecessary.
Yeah, it's a solution in weight of a problem, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Let me ask you, Tyler, ask the last question. Considering the compliance, if you look at some of the rare earth metals, I think like the 3T and G, if you go to a lot of these local communities like DRC, for example, most of them would know about gold, but a lot of them will not know about tungsten, tantalum, and all the other elements. How do they factor in when we are putting out these measures to get their own contribution as far as maybe the tracking and getting these companies to comply? And then what is the difficulty for the companies that deal with these rare earth metals? What is the pressure on them to comply, given that sometimes you can turn a blind eye because you don't have that huge customer base that's going to put a lot of pressure on them to comply. Yeah. Well, most of them are used for security purposes, maybe military things and stuff like that, that the public is not accurately aware. So what is the incentive for them to comply? Yeah. It's a lot of good questions. Well, I would say you know, in the DRC at least, particularly in the East, coltan is a very common, big supporter of miners. So people really know. I mean, in the DRC, they probably know more. Miners in the DRC on the ground know far more about coltan mining than I do, obviously, and way more about the ins and outs of how to wash and process, etc.
than I would. So I think that on the ground in these producing countries, and that also goes for the risks, by the way, I should say. In my experience, local actors have a far better sense of the risk than anybody outside the country. Now, that may seem obvious, but I think sometimes, we assume that, this stuff is really hard to find out. And in fact, it's not hard to find out. It's like you have to talk to 3 people and then you know everything. I mean, everything is an open secret of who's trading with whom and what dirty business they're in and what their uncle might have done with this armed group and yada, yada, yada. I mean, everything is really open. And then, of course, I think you're right, though. The downstream users, they needed a little bit of education on some of these metals. A lot of them didn't, materials, maybe a lot of them didn't realize that they had tungsten in some of their products, and they had to do digging. They had to do their due diligence. They had to look at their bill of materials, their BOMs, they're called, and find out what are all the products and subcomponents and reach out to the suppliers and ask them. Where we were in 2012 is radically different in this case, because I think in 2012 companies were like, it's impossible, downstream companies. And now actually all those systems that gave them visibility on the minerals has actually served them very well, for example, in times of COVID, where there were supply shortages, and they're able to now forecast much better their supply chains because of these requirements. So there's interesting sort of spillover that businesses have more visibility now into the raw material inputs than they've ever had because of things like this, but also requirements in Europe around chemical use, like REACH and ROS, for example.
No, I was thinking that would be a really good article actually on this COVID dynamic, how the spillover effects have been impacted. Yeah. I'm glad you brought it up, short article.
And then I think the pressure, you're right, that not all of these metals are going into consumer products, but I would say it's not the consumer itself that's applying pressure right now. I mean, you or me, I don't think, but when I buy a car, I'm like, is this a conflict-free car? I mean, and certainly weapons manufacturers are not like, hey, this is a conflict-free bullet. Would be a bit weird to be like conflict-free tanks and machines of war, but they're responsibly sourced. So I think you're right. But there is a major market access issue, because collectively these companies have come together and said, we will only source from smelters, refiners that go through audits. So it's a commercial requirement to do business for a refiner. So if I'm a tantalum smelter in China and I don't care about these laws, but my tantalum is going to end up in the semiconductors of Apple or Intel or Siemens, then they all have requirements that I have to go through the audit, or I cannot be part of their supply chains. It's simple as that. So as a result of that, the consumer pressure almost is besides the point, because the companies have made it a requirement for entering their supply chains. They have to comply. Now, that doesn't mean that enforcement is great. There's a lot of gaming of the system. There's still a lot of problems. For example, on the ground in the DRC, 3T has improved. Gold is still a mess. So, I mean, I'm simplifying it, but it's still very, very complex. Companies are not good at development problems. They're good at, risk avoidance, which is sort of binary. It's either you comply and I do business blind, or you don't comply and I don't do business. They're not very good at doing business with conditions that I need to follow. I need to do business, but I need to follow them and make sure that this is, they either want to say yes or no and then continue what they do. So there's still a lot of work to be done there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tyler. You've been very generous with your time. One last final valedictory question would be around the Icl Alliance, which in many ways is a way to sort of, audit the auditors, having some streamlining. Are you in touch with them in any way, or trying to see how they can facilitate the same kind of mainstreaming you're trying to do?
We are. I mean, they have, I think what they do is super useful and necessary in terms of the, ensuring comparability in the governance and standard setting processes of certification programs. We're also working with ITC, the International Trade Center, because they have a sustainability standards map. And we're working on whether we can sort of automate a self-assessment process for an alignment process for a certification program until we do, because our process is 18 months, it's very robust, but some may want to say, well, right now, can I just do a screen? So we are working with them right now. It's still very early days. I would say two things. Icl right now they're not yet looking at the alignment of those standards with global government-backed standards. And that's where I think what we're looking at, it's one thing to say, are the private sector standards, robust in how they're set and governed? But we are saying, well, governments have said you must do this, but are they actually implementing it? We don't know. So that's where we're doing. We're benchmarking against, which is a little bit different. And I would say our governments have also said for now, they want us, meaning the Secretariat of the OECD, to keep a real close hand on these issues, because a lot of it relate to interpretation of these standards that, if left to the service providers who are paid by the standard initiatives, might lead to more favorable interpretations. So for now, our governments have said they want us to lead this alignment process, but with a view to eventually handing it over.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much again, Tyler. This has been so informative, and I'm sure the students have learned a lot, as I have myself, and this is really a public service you're doing in the next generation of mineral certification professionals, hopefully. So, and I will put it on our Minerals Materials Society channel so that others can also benefit from it. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Good luck, everybody, with the rest of your classes. And if you ever have any questions, don't hesitate to email.
Okay, cheers.
Cheers. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Okay, so good. I hope you found both of the speakers to be useful. It's very important to get sort of that perspective from the trenches. Did you have any follow-up questions for me based on what you've heard, or any kind of things which you felt were, maybe they were not giving you the full story or anything like that?
Yeah, I got a question.
Yeah.
So both kind of downplayed the US-China dynamics. I thought it was very interesting for Tyler not to say that we've resolved the political things. And I'm just wondering if that's a disconnect between